Hello, guys, and finally we reached that moment when millions of Russians begin asking this question: why the so called special military operation lasts so long? It actually outlasts the Great Patriotic War for the Russians, the Second World War since their involvement in 1941. And there are tons of such questions under videos of the Russian propagandists, and even during Putin's annual address, where he tried to persuade that everything goes according to the plan. But no, not just the blitzkrieg failed, war returned back to dozens of Russian regions with explosions, with no-fly zone, with more and more people conscripted to the meat grinders on the front lines, and not only in Ukraine, also in the Russian regions. Finally, people started asking these questions, and the Russian propaganda literally does not have an answer. They started threatening the viewers, saying they need to return back to the Stalin management style and send more and more people to the special military operation. But let's be realistic. Even if it was not happening in Russia, this is a war. This is Russian war against Ukraine. This is the largest war on the European continent since the Second World War. And it's pretty absurd to try and pretend that nothing special is happening when the Ukrainian drones, the Ukrainian missiles literally destroyed 40% of their oil industry. We keep targeting various military facilities close to big Russian cities, cancel flights, and many more. So today I have decided to translate these questions that I have analyzed, that I had to listen to during Putin's address. That's pretty difficult, but it is very important to know what the enemy thinks, how they feel inside Russia. And that is why I invite you to subscribe to this channel to know the truth from my part of the world. My name is Anna. I'm from Ukraine. I'm in Ukraine, and I'm always happy to share this real information, because making any decisions, you need to know the facts. You need to know what's happening on the grounds, both here in Ukraine, but also inside Russia, because honestly, it is the weakest ever. And I believe that millions and millions of Russians feel that too. And I don't think that all of them are frightened of the collapse of the Russian Federation. Many actually wait for this opportunity, develop roadmaps, and think how they can control and safeguard this process. But let's begin with this recent annual address that Putin had. It's a tradition similar to many, many, many countries, with one very big difference. All the questions that people put are pre-filtered, totally censored, controlled, literally like everything inside Russia, especially around Putin. But even with this level of censorship, they had to allow some questions which targeted the weakest points of the present life inside the Russian Federation: the budget, the increase in taxes, and a lot of questions. Why does it take so long to defeat Ukraine? Before the invasion, back in 2022, the full-scale invasion, Russian propagandists persuaded not just Russians, not just Ukrainians, but literally all the world that Ukraine would surrender in a couple of days. They will change the regime, put a pro-Russian puppet, I don't know, a clone of Lukashenko, and everything will return back to the USSR standards. But no, they failed. And it's so pathetic to watch how now this Kremlin goblin tries to persuade you, tries to persuade the White House, various negotiators, that he is kind when he agrees to occupy Ukrainian Donbas, just diplomatically, so that we surrender a really small part of the Ukrainian territory, but very important to us, which he claimed he would otherwise take in, like a day. I am sorry, here we are, 4 years after the beginning of Putin's so-called blitzkrieg. And a question that I don't hear, like Witkov asking, or Rubio maybe, if you say that Anyway, you will get all of Ukraine. Why didn't you during all these 4 years? What happened? What happened? Russia is so strong. Why didn't you manage to get what you want? They claim they want Kyiv. And by the way, your intelligence services prove that Putin's ambition is to recreate the USSR with other former Soviet republics, which include Latvia, Estonia. They have interest in Poland. They have interest in Finland. Now, when Lavrov sensed the weakness coming from the White House in the context of NATO, they began talking about this 1997 NATO borders, which means to exclude countries which joined the alliance since 1997. And that's an open demonstration of Putin's plans to recreate the USSR, with one very big exception. Nobody from the former Soviet republics wants this project. And second, Putin does not have powers, does not have influence to do it. Because once again, please share this truth. That's super important. That's what could change a lot. During these 4 years, they did not manage full-scale war. 1 million lost Russian soldiers. They did not manage to occupy more than 1.75% of Ukraine. They would need 100 years or more to get all the territory at this pace, and they are very exhausted. They don't have money. They have trillions of deficit in their state budget. They already have a lot of the dissatisfied people who start asking this question: what on earth special military operation that is if explosions are heard in Belgorod, in Kursk, in Astrakhan, in St. Petersburg, in Moscow? Where is this special military operation taking place? Not in Ukraine, as it turns out. I believe a very important change took place in 2022, 2023, when not only we managed to protect and liberate most of our territories that they actually took, that's a very weird term to use here, but took by surprise. Why? Because back in 2022, we knew something bad was coming, as always, from Russia. But our sanity, our normalcy persuaded us that, well, maybe it will be close to the front line. Maybe we would need, like to be more active in Donetsk, Luhansk regions. But on the night of the first day of the full-scale invasion, they literally shelled every regional center in Ukraine. That was insane, and that triggered the collapse of the Russian Federation. And they failed to achieve what they wanted. They were heading to Kyiv. Do not believe these gestures of goodwill that they use, this euphemism, when they talk about their escape from Crimea or their escape from Kherson. They have nothing to give to their population. And it's absurd to say that they retreated from Kherson as a gesture of goodwill, but at the same time, they demand Kherson to be given to them diplomatically in the result of this so-called negotiations. So please see Russia's weakness, see their inability to achieve the aims of the so-called special military operation. And here I need to remind you, the aim was to occupy Ukraine, to put Russian president instead of the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian president, and start acting with Ukraine as they act with Belarus, then potentially mobilize Ukrainian people to attack other countries that were previously unlucky to be a part of the USSR or to be a part of the Warsaw Pact, which goes for Poland, which goes for Czechia and many other, Slovakia. That's why they actually support pro-Russian parties, pro-Russian leaders, unfortunately, in these countries that now demonstrate this very different approach to the general policies and strategies of the European Union. That's a danger inside the European Union. But with all these plans, with all this pathos, with all the Russian soldiers putting on their parade uniforms, everything collapsed, and collapsed greatly, so that Putin organized serious purges, substitute ministers of defense. He changed so many generals and heads of staff during this period, not as a demonstration of success, but as a demonstration of this constant strain of failures. And now, the budget is empty. people started going out on protests in Far East, in Bashkortostan, in Tatarstan, in Astrakhan. They go out against the increasing taxes. They go out on the streets because of the shortages they experience in their regions. I mean, like empty budgets, shorter working weeks, lower salaries, and absence of gasoline. That was a nationwide protest of taxi drivers, which was perhaps the first nationwide protest in the Russian Federation. And now, ordinary, apolitical Russians that cheered for the special military operation start asking Putin what's wrong. Russia, for those of you who do not remember, at the beginning of the Second World War was on the side of the Nazi Germany. And here I connect a video that actually debunks myths of the Great Patriotic War. That's how they call that part of the Second World War where the Russians and the Soviet Union joined the rest of the allies who fought against the Nazi Germany. But between 1939 and 1941, they were accomplice with Hitler. And they actually divided Europe according to their appetites. And only after Hitler broke this agreement, known as Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they started fighting together with France, Germany, the USA, and actually that Lend-Lease, that technical support from the United States was one of the main reasons, together with the Russian careless attitude to the human life, because many of the Soviet army victories could have been less bloody if they would wait, if they did not want to organize something to celebrate a particular date in a communist calendar. But anyway, the Soviet Union participated in the Second World War from 1941, 2 years after it began, to 1945, which makes it 4 years. They call it the Great Patriotic War, separating once again themselves from the rest of the world that fought against this awful Nazi regime. So, what do we have here? This Great Patriotic War lasted for 4 years. And during these 4 years, they managed to reach Berlin and put the Soviet flag on Reichstag. And now lots of Russians say, okay, why did it take us 4 years? In times of the Second World War, when people had less technologies, less opportunities, but in 4 years, the army managed to reach, Berlin. Why can't we reach not just Kiev, they say, but literally Donetsk region that was promised as something that they already have? And Putin has no answer. Just think about 4 years, and they cannot reach the borders of two regions, which they began occupying back in 2014, which makes 11 years. So everyone in Ukraine sees it as total BS. I mean, this capitulation agreement or peace proposal where they encourage Ukraine to praise Russia with our territory that they cannot occupy because of the war crimes that Russia committed here. Just think about that. Just think how absurd that is, and please remember, this so-called special military operation already lasts as Great Patriotic War for the Russians with way, way, way less, literally no achievements, but a lot of losses. They don't care about human life, so let's forget about this 1 million, almost 200,000 soldiers. And let's have a look at dozens of the Russian regions that are an active war zone. Belgorod, Kursk, people relocate from that places. Also, explosions heard in St. Petersburg. They had to cancel a naval parade there, Putin's favorite. Why? Because they feared the Ukrainian drones. Also, Moscow is under constant attacks with cancelled flights. Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, three seas, Azov, Caspian, Black, destroyed Black Sea Fleet, also destroyed a lot of military production facilities, and the most important achievement that ruins their war budget is the destroyed Russian oil industry. We began with depots, continued with refineries and ports, terminals, and now we are even working with these mining sites. Russia does not know how to save their oil because the shadow fleet is now under attack. So, literally, they don't have a lot of time left. Trust me. The collapse of the Russian Federation is inevitable, just as it was with the USSR. And Bush came to Ukraine, Bush the first, to persuade that we need to remain a part of the USSR. And then a couple of months later, congratulated Ukraine and dozens of former Soviet republics with the independence. Because it's not even our strength, resilience, that will lead to the collapse of the Russian Federation. It is their weakness, it is their inability to see the reality behind the smoke of the Russian propaganda. And now Solovyov, Putin's main propagandist, speaks about the need to act as in times of Stalin and actually push all people to the front lines, because their failures are not the result of Putin's mismanagement, corrupt generals, destroyed Russian army, but lack of people. So they want again to solve this problem, constant failures, with millions of Russians sent to the meat grinders. And it is the war of the 21st century with drones. You cannot decide everything simply by sacrificing more millions of the apolitical Russians. Everything is boiling inside this very unnatural construct, Frankenstein, that can give birth to many more democratic nations. And the fact that you know little about them does not mean that they will start nuking each other. Russia, modern Russia, with Putin on its top, with Kadyrov, is a threat to the civilized world. So, a lot of presidents in the US, in Europe, gave a lot of chances to Russia, rebooted these relations so many times, it didn't work. So, maybe it's time to give a chance to other countries, to other nations that are now oppressed and suffer, and also, invest a lot of their resources, a lot of their money, and even their people in this war that destroys everything. Please share these videos because many people know nothing about Russia and provide, these arguments based on Cold War messages, based on Putin's fake addresses. All of you remember how at the beginning of the full-scale invasion he promised that in 3 days he would have all Ukraine. Now, 4 years later, he cannot reach the borders of the region he attacked back in 2014. Spread the truth. Spread the truth and let me know, how do you think, when will Russia collapse? What is the year? What is the date? Do you feel it coming? And maybe share some of your memories. Did you believe that the USSR would collapse back in the 90s? Subscribe to Anna from Ukraine, that's my first main channel. Also follow me on social media platforms, the links to which you will find in the description of this video. Thank you for buying me coffees, becoming patrons and sponsors of the channels. Check the merch shop, the link in the description too. It is a perfect place for meaningful presence that will turn you into the ambassadors of Ukraine. Love you so much. Thank you for this precious community and the ability to speak the truth. Slava Ukraini!